In the dim streets of Prague at the turn of the 20th century, a solitary figure walked beneath gas lamps, his shadow flickering on cobblestones slick with rain. This was Franz Kafka, a man whose name would become synonymous with dread, bureaucracy, and alienation. He never sought fame, and he published only a fraction of his writings in his lifetime. Yet today his stories and parables echo through philosophy, psychology, and politics. To speak of something as Kafkaesque is to invoke a world at once ordinary and absurd, where meaning collapses under the weight of systems too vast to comprehend. Kafka's work defies easy classification. Was he a modernist novelist, a religious allegorist, or an existential philosopher? Scholars still debate where to place him. His fiction hovers uneasily between literature and philosophy, but its impact is undeniable. Jean-Paul Sartre once remarked that existence precedes essence, a maxim of existentialism. Kafka, decades earlier, seemed to dramatize that maxim without naming it, showing us characters who are thrown into situations without explanation, forced to create meaning where none is given. Take The Trial, written in 1914. The opening line is deceptively simple. Someone must have slandered Joseph K. For one morning without having done anything truly wrong. He was arrested. It is a sentence that drops you directly into absurdity. No crime is named, no reason is offered. A man is simply arrested, his fate sealed by forces opaque and unreachable. As the narrative unfolds, we realize the trial is not a legal process at all, but a nightmare. An allegory of existence itself, where guilt is assumed and explanation denied. Philosophers still argue whether Joseph K.'s crime is theological, political, or existential. Is he guilty before God, guilty before the state, or guilty simply by being alive? There is something profoundly cinematic about Kafka's world. Imagine a courtroom in which no judge is visible, only clerks shuffling endless papers. You can almost hear the scratching of pens, the drone of whispers, the creak of floorboards and narrow staircases that lead nowhere. The absurdity is not flamboyant. It is quiet, suffocating, relentless. Hannah Arendt once described totalitarianism as the domination of individuals by endless bureaucracy, and Kafka's fictions often read as premonitions of that reality. And yet Kafka's philosophy is not merely political. It is metaphysical. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa awakens one morning to discover he has been transformed into a monstrous insect. When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning from unsettling dreams, he found himself changed in his bed into a gigantic insect. The sentence is blunt, horrifying, almost casual in its announcement. What does it mean? Scholars still debate. Is the insect a symbol of alienated labor, as Marxist critics argue? Is it a metaphor for sin, for the fall of man, for the unbridgeable distance between human and divine? Or is it simply absurd, reflecting the randomness of existence in a godless universe? Quirky details about Kafka's own life seep into these stories. By day, he worked at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute, drafting reports on factory injuries, wading through the labyrinth of bureaucracy he would later immortalize in fiction. By night, he wrote feverishly, often until dawn, producing fragments of novels he never finished. He instructed his friend Max Brod to burn all his manuscripts after his death. Brod disobeyed, and because of that betrayal, or act of loyalty, Kafka's philosophy lives. Perhaps what makes Kafka so enduring is not he offers answers, but that he sharpens the questions. His philosophy is the philosophy of uncertainty, of existing within a system whose rules are incomprehensible. He forces us to look at the structures we live under, government, religion, even family, and ask whether they are rational at all. He places us in Joseph K.'s shoes, in Gregor Samsa's shell, and makes us feel what it is like to be judged without cause, transformed without consent, lost in a world that refuses explanation. Kafka's world is one of thresholds, doors that never open, gates that never close, paths that lead endlessly to nowhere. In his parable Before the Law, a man from the country comes seeking entry to the law. A gatekeeper refuses him entry, but also does not turn him away. The man waits for years, growing old, pleading for access, until finally, on his deathbed, he learns the doorway was meant only for him, and now it will be closed. The story is short, no more than a page, but its implications are vast. What is the law? Is it divine revelation, justice, or the meaning of life itself? Scholars still argue. Some read it as a critique of institutional religion, others as a meditation on the impossibility of ultimate truth. The parable is chilling because of its familiarity. You can picture the man waiting outside the gate, his hands trembling, his face lined with years of unanswered questions. You can almost hear the creak of the gate as it looms before him. Always visible, but forever out of reach. Kafka captures that terrible space between hope and futility, where waiting itself becomes the story. It is not the denial of truth that torments us, but the perpetual postponement of it. This tension resonates with modern philosophy. Existentialists like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre wrestled with the absence of clear meaning in human life. Kierkegaard spoke of the leap of faith in the face of the absurd. Nietzsche declared the death of God and the burden of creating values anew. Kafka's characters seem trapped in that space between faith and despair, caught in worlds where transcendence is hinted at but never arrives. Albert Camus would later describe the absurd as the confrontation between human longing for meaning and the universe's silence. Kafka, decades earlier, was dramatizing that silence in every unfinished sentence, every locked door, every unanswered trial. Yet Kafka's philosophy is not only bleak. There are moments of strange, fragile beauty. In The Castle, the protagonist K struggles to gain recognition from an inscrutable bureaucracy that governs a village. Letters arrive, summons are sent, but clarity never comes. And yet, within the labyrinth, characters fall in love, friendships flicker, and small acts of kindness pierce the gloom. Life, even when absurd, continues. In one of his notebooks, Kafka wrote, "There is hope, but not for us." The line is haunting, but it reveals the paradox at the heart of his thought. Despair and hope intertwine, each giving shape to the other. Quirky details of Kafka's daily existence reinforce this paradox. He was, by most accounts, shy and awkward, a man who never married and who often felt estranged even from those he loved. Yet he was also known to laugh loudly when reading his own work aloud, treating stories like the Metamorphosis not as solemn sermons, but as dark comedies. Imagine the author chuckling as he describes Gregor Samsa's tiny legs flailing helplessly. It reminds us that absurdity contains humor as well as horror. Scholars still debate whether Kafka intended his tales as tragedies, comedies, or both. Perhaps, like life itself, they resist such neat categories. The image of the insect in the Metamorphosis has become one of the most enduring symbols in literature. But what does it mean? Some biographers note Kafka's own feelings of insignificance, his sense of being a burden on his family, mirrored in Gregor's transformation. Others see the story as a critique of modern labor, where workers are reduced to parts of a machine, valued only for their productivity. And still others read it as a parable of spiritual exile, echoing the alienation of a soul cut off from God. The debates persist because Kafka never explained. He offered images, not interpretations. He left the work of meaning to us. That ambiguity is itself philosophical. In a letter, Kafka wrote, "A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us." His stories are not meant to instruct, but to shatter complacency, to break the surface of ordinary thought and expose the icy depths below. His philosophy is not a system, not a doctrine, but a mode of perception, to see the world as unstable, uncanny, layered with unseen power. Even his language reflects this. Kafka's German prose is famously clear, precise, stripped of ornament. Unlike the dense abstractions of philosophers, his sentences are transparent, and yet what they describe is opaque, unresolvable. The clarity of style and the obscurity of meaning clash, producing the unsettling effect we now call Kafkaesque. It is the sense of being trapped in a system that is perfectly logical and yet utterly incomprehensible. This paradox has made Kafka central to 20th century thought. Legal theorists find in him critiques of justice systems that grind on without fairness. Psychologists see echoes of his strained family relationships, especially with his domineering father, in stories of guilt and punishment. Theologians glimpse allegories of divine silence, the unreachable castle on the hill, the law forever deferred. Philosophers of existence see in him the purest dramatization of absurdity. Each field claims him, but none can contain him. In thinking about Kafka, it is impossible to ignore the shadow of his father, Hermann Kafka, a domineering figure whose presence shaped Franz's inner world. The famous letter to his father, never delivered but preserved among his papers, is as much a philosophical text as a personal one. In it, Kafka confesses, "You have given me, by your example and by your words, a sense of my own nothingness. The letter reads like a trial in itself. Franz the defendant, his father the judge, and guilt the only possible verdict. The document illuminates one of the central themes of Kafka's philosophy, the crushing weight of authority, both external and internalized. For Kafka, the family home becomes a microcosm of the wider world, a place where judgment comes without explanation, where the accused never stands a chance. This dynamic spills into his fiction. Joseph K. in the trial never learns his crime, yet he cannot escape judgment. Gregor Samsa in the Metamorphosis is rejected by his family, not for what he has done, but for what he has become. Authority in Kafka's world is arbitrary, impersonal, and absolute. Scholars still debate whether this reflects Kafka's personal neuroses or whether he was capturing something essential about modernity itself. Was Kafka a private sufferer exposing his inner turmoil, or was he a prophet of the bureaucratic nightmare that the 20th century would unleash? The truth perhaps is both. The historical context makes this question sharper. Kafka lived in Prague, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a society layered with ethnic tensions, imperial bureaucracy, and the grinding machinery of modern governance. He wrote in German, but lived among Czechs and Jews, inhabiting multiple identities without fully belonging to any of them. His work often reflects this sense of estrangement. In The Castle, the protagonist K. seeks recognition from the mysterious officials who rule the village, but his status is never confirmed. He is always a stranger, always excluded. Here the personal bleeds into the political. Kafka's philosophy is the philosophy of the outsider, the one who cannot find a place in the system. And yet Kafka's fiction is not merely autobiography disguised. It resonates because it captures something universal about the modern condition. In the 20th century, as empires collapsed and bureaucracies expanded, ordinary people increasingly found themselves entangled in systems they could not understand or control. Kafka sensed this earlier than most. His characters face labyrinthine processes, endless paperwork, faceless officials. They are crushed not by dramatic violence but by dull, suffocating procedures. Hannah Arendt, writing decades later, described the banality of evil in totalitarian regimes, the idea that oppression often appears not in monstrous acts but in everyday routines. Kafka's parables anticipate this insight with uncanny precision. Quirky details of Kafka's writing process underline this prophetic quality. He often wrote at night, after long hours at his insurance office. In the silence of the early morning, he produced pages of prose that were at once crystal clear and deeply unsettling. His diaries reveal a man obsessed with failure, failure of body, failure of will, failure of writing itself. "All I am," he once wrote, "is literature." Yet even this statement feels ambiguous. Did he mean that writing was his only purpose, or that writing had consumed his life, leaving nothing else? That uncertainty is quintessentially Kafkaesque. Every assertion undermines itself. Every truth dissolves into ambiguity. The philosophical dimension deepens when we consider how Kafka portrays guilt. Unlike in traditional narratives, guilt in Kafka does not arise from an act. Joseph K. has committed no identifiable crime, and yet he is guilty. Gregor Samsa has done nothing to deserve his transformation, yet he is punished. This recalls the theological idea of original sin, the notion that humanity is guilty simply by existing. But it also anticipates existential philosophy, where guilt is redefined as responsibility for existence itself. Sartre would later write that man is condemned to be free, burdened with choices he cannot escape. Kafka's characters live that condemnation not in freedom, but in its dark reflection. They are condemned without ever being allowed to choose. And here lies one of Kafka's most fascinating contradictions. He was both a secular modern and a man haunted by religious imagery. He distanced himself from traditional Judaism, yet his work is filled with echoes of scripture, trials, sacrifices, inaccessible laws. Scholars still argue whether Kafka was a religious writer disguising theology as fiction, or a secular writer using religious motifs to dramatize existential despair. His notebooks are full of aphorisms that sound almost like scripture. From a certain point onward, there is no longer any turning back. That is the point that must be reached. They strike the reader like fragments of revelation, though revelation of what remains obscure. This ambiguity has allowed Kafka's philosophy to be adopted by multiple traditions. Theologians see him as a modern prophet, a Job of the 20th century, questioning God in an age of silence. Existentialists claim him as a fellow traveler, exposing the absurdity of existence. Marxists read him as a critic of capitalist alienation, where workers like Gregor Samsa are reduced to mere insects. Legal theorists find in him a devastating allegory of systems that administer justice without mercy. Each interpretation is convincing, yet none exhausts him. Like the gate in Before the Law, Kafka's work is always open, always closed, always pointing beyond itself. And perhaps that is the essence of Kafka's philosophy, the refusal of finality. He wrote fragments of novels he never finished, parables that end in silence, stories that dissolve into uncertainty. He instructed Max Brod to burn his manuscripts, and yet they survived, incomplete and ambiguous. His life and his art resist closure. Kafka teaches us to dwell in uncertainty, to confront systems that cannot be explained, to acknowledge that meaning itself may be deferred indefinitely. In that sense, his philosophy is not a solution but a mirror, forcing us to see our own bewilderment reflected back at us. Kafka's philosophy becomes even clearer when placed against the broader backdrop of 20th century existentialism. He never identified himself as part of the movement, but his stories breathe the same air of anxiety and confrontation with meaninglessness that defined it. Albert Camus, in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus, described Kafka as an existential artist who dramatized the absurd. For Camus, the absurd arises when the human longing for clarity crashes against the silence of the universe. Kafka's characters live precisely at that intersection, yearning for explanations that never come, pleading before gates that never open. Take Joseph K. once more. His trial is not only a legal proceeding, but a confrontation with absurdity itself. Every room he enters promises clarity, yet each meeting with officials only deepens the confusion. The more he seeks truth, the further it recedes. Camus saw in this structure not despair but paradoxical resistance. He wrote that Kafka's works are open to hope, because even in the absence of resolution, the act of searching affirms human dignity. But here scholars divide. Some insist Kafka was ultimately pessimistic, his worlds void of redemption. Others argue that by showing us absurdity so starkly, he points toward the possibility of freedom within it. Jean-Paul Sartre, though less directly engaged with Kafka, shared similar concerns. Sartre declared that existence precedes essence, that humans are not born with purpose but must invent it themselves. Kafka's characters, however, seem denied even that freedom. Gregor Samsa cannot choose his form, Joseph K. cannot choose his trial. They are not free creators but trapped subjects. In this sense, Kafka is both close to and distant from existentialism. He stages the theater of meaninglessness, but instead of offering freedom as a response, he leaves us suspended, uncertain whether resistance is possible at all. The imagery of suspension pervades his work. In the castle, K trudges through snow-covered fields, summoned by unseen officials who never appear. He reaches doors that never open, letters that never clarify, promises that never materialize. You can almost feel the crunch of snow under his boots, the endless white landscape stretching with no destination in sight. It is a vision of human striving turned inwards, energy expended without end. Scholars still argue whether the castle should be read as a theological allegory, with the castle as heaven forever beyond reach, or as a political allegory of bureaucratic power. Both interpretations illuminate the story, but neither exhausts it. Kafka's affinity with Kierkegaard is another key thread. Kierkegaard wrote about the leap of faith, the necessity of belief in the face of absurdity. Kafka seems to inhabit the moment just before that leap, staring into the abyss, but never jumping. His notebooks are filled with fragments that echo religious yearning. In one he writes, "He is free who is lost in the most extreme sense." The words sound mystical, yet their context resists resolution. Was Kafka affirming freedom through surrender or confessing despair at never attaining it? Like Kierkegaard, he circled the problem of faith, but unlike Kierkegaard, he never resolved it. His influence extended beyond philosophy into politics and culture. After World War II, when Europe witnessed the horrors of totalitarian regimes, Kafka's visions of suffocating bureaucracy and senseless judgment felt prophetic. Survivors of the Holocaust read the trial in the castle as uncanny prefigurations of their own experiences. Papers demanded, identities denied, sentences pronounced without cause. Hannah Arendt, analyzing the rise of totalitarianism, found Kafka's imagery of faceless power illuminating. In his quiet stories, she saw dramatize the mechanisms by which individuality is erased and human beings reduced to cases, files, and numbers. And yet, even amid such bleakness, Kafka's philosophy is not merely one of despair. There is in his works a strange resilience, an insistence on continuing despite futility. Joseph K. continues to search. Gregor Samsa, even in his insect form, worries about catching the train to work. Characters persist, even when meaning evaporates. This persistence has philosophical weight. Camus' Sisyphus rolls his boulder forever, and Camus tells us we must imagine him happy. Kafka's characters trudge, crawl, argue, and plead, and in their ceaseless movement, they mirror the human condition itself, condemned to seek meaning, even if meaning never arrives. This paradox of despair and perseverance is perhaps Kafka's deepest legacy. His philosophy does not resolve. It unsettles. He shows us a mirror of modern existence in which systems grow vast and incomprehensible, meaning recedes endlessly, and yet life continues with its tiny gestures of hope and humor. To call something Kafkaesque is to name that strange mixture of absurdity and persistence, oppression and resilience, dread and laughter. It is a philosophy not of conclusions but of conditions, conditions that still describe our own age with uncanny accuracy. To understand Kafka's philosophy fully, one must also consider the quiet but persistent thread of his Jewish identity. He was born into a German-speaking Jewish family in Prague, part of a minority caught between Czech nationalism and German culture. His relationship to Judaism was complex, neither devout nor indifferent, but marked by a sense of distance. He attended synagogue irregularly, and yet Jewish motifs seep into his writing like whispers from an ancestral memory. In his notebooks, he once confessed, "What have I in common with Jews? I have hardly anything in common with myself." The remark captures his estrangement not only from his heritage, but from his own existence. And yet, Jewish mysticism fascinated him. He read about the Kabbalah, about Hasidic stories, about the enigmatic figures of rabbis and prophets. The world of hidden laws and ineffable truths resonated with his own literary imagination. In The Trial, the inaccessible court evokes the hidden god of Jewish mysticism, present yet unreachable, powerful yet silent. Some scholars see in Kafka's parables echoes of Talmudic argumentation, where questions multiply endlessly and answers remain provisional. The open-endedness of his stories resembles the perpetual deferral of meaning in religious commentary. Quirky anecdotes reinforce this connection. Friends recalled Kafka attending lectures on Yiddish theater, fascinated by its blend of folklore, comedy, and tragedy. He admired the performers, even as he recognized their marginal status in European culture. He once remarked that Yiddish theater had an immediacy that German literature lacked, a rawness that captured the precariousness of Jewish life. That precariousness seeps into his philosophy. The sense of living under constant judgment, vulnerable to forces that never explain themselves. His short parable, Before the Law, has often been read through a Jewish lens. The man from the country, waiting endlessly for access, mirrors the Jewish search for divine revelation, forever postponed. The gatekeeper resembles not only a bureaucrat, but also the angel of judgment, bearing access to transcendence. For some interpreters, the story dramatizes the experience of exile, spiritual exile from God, cultural exile from society. Others reject the religious reading entirely, insisting it is about the structures of power in modern life. Historians and philosophers still argue where to locate the meaning. But the ambiguity itself is telling. Kafka wrote at the crossroads of theology and modernity, refusing to settle on either side. The image of exile extends further. In his diaries, Kafka wrote of feeling like a stranger in his own city. He was German-speaking in a Czech world, Jewish in a Christian empire, modern in a traditional family. Exile was not a temporary condition, but his permanent state. This sense of unbelonging becomes central to his philosophy. His characters are perpetually displaced. Gregor Samsa confined to his room, Joseph K. shuffled between unfamiliar offices, K. in the castle wandering endlessly through alien snow. Their exile is both physical and metaphysical, a representation of the human condition in a world without clear home or final truth. Religious language haunts even Kafka's secular passages. In the trial, a priest tells Joseph K. the parable of before the law, offering interpretation after interpretation, none of which provide closure. This scene recalls the hermeneutics of Scripture, texts explained endlessly, meanings deferred infinitely. But unlike Scripture, Kafka offers no promise of ultimate revelation. The priest concludes only that the man's fate is sealed, his waiting in vain. It is theology stripped of salvation, law without grace, and yet hope flickers. In his notebooks, Kafka wrote enigmatic aphorisms such as, "The Messiah will come only when he is no longer necessary. He will come only after his arrival." It is a paradox worthy of the Talmud, the promise of salvation that negates itself, hope that exists precisely in its impossibility. Here, Kafka sounds like a mystic, but one who refuses the comfort of final answers. He lives in the tension, and he asks us to live there too. This tension between faith and despair, mysticism and secularism, gives Kafka's philosophy its distinctive unease. He never resolved his Jewish identity, nor his religious questions. He allowed them to hang, unresolved, in his parables. And perhaps this unresolved quality is the point. Meaning for Kafka is not something to be grasped, but something forever deferred. Like the door before which the man waits, like the castle forever glimpsed but never reached. His philosophy is a theology without God, a mysticism without revelation, an exile without return. When Kafka died in 1924, at the age of 40, he left behind instructions that all his unpublished manuscripts should be burned. It was an act of renunciation that fit his lifelong tendency toward incompletion and uncertainty. He feared misunderstanding, or perhaps he feared exposure. Either way, he wanted silence. But his friend Max Brod, to whom he entrusted the task, defied him. Instead of fire, Brod chose preservation. He gathered Kafka's unfinished novels, his fragments, his parables, and saw them into print. Without Brod's disobedience, Kafka would likely be a forgotten clerk, his philosophy dissolved into ash. Instead, his name became a byword for the anxieties of the modern age. Brod himself defended the decision, arguing that Kafka's work belonged not to him alone, but to the world. He wrote for the world. Brod insisted, and the world must hear him. The betrayal, if it was one, ensured Kafka's immortality. Yet the controversy remains a philosophical question in its own right. Was Brod right to preserve what the author wished destroyed? Philosophers still debate whether the will of the creator should outweigh the potential value to humanity. The irony is unmistakable. A man who dramatized the futility of human striving is remembered precisely because his own wishes were denied. Once published, Kafka's works quickly spread across Europe. Critics in the 1930s saw in him a prophet of the bureaucratic nightmare that was unfolding in totalitarian regimes. The trial in the castle felt eerily familiar in societies where paperwork could condemn and faceless officials determined fates. After World War II, survivors of the concentration camps read Kafka as though he had foreseen their experience, waiting endlessly for permissions, judged without cause, swallowed by systems that crushed individuality. The word Kafkaesque entered the lexicon, describing situations that were simultaneously absurd and oppressive, mundane and nightmarish. Legal scholars found particular resonance in Kafka's depictions of judgment. Courts in his stories are not places of justice, but of perpetual postponement. The accused is never acquitted, only dragged deeper into endless process. This mirrored anxieties about the modern legal system, where procedures multiply but fairness evaporates. Philosophers of law began citing Kafka as a cautionary figure, a reminder that legality without transparency can become indistinguishable from tyranny. In this way, Kafka the novelist became Kafka the legal philosopher, his stories functioning as parables of jurisprudence gone awry. Politically, Kafka became a touchstone for critics of bureaucracy. Hannah Arendt saw in his work an anticipation of the faceless mechanisms of totalitarian rule. Theodor Adorno described him as a chronicler of a world where rationality collapses into irrationality, where systems designed to serve humanity turn into instruments of domination. And yet, others interpreted him differently. Some Marxist critics argued that his insect and his courts were allegories of capitalist exploitation, not political totalitarianism. Scholars still argue whether Kafka should be read primarily as a prophet of authoritarianism, a critic of capitalism, or a metaphysician of absurdity. Each school of thought finds support in his words, but none can claim exclusive ownership. Literature, too, felt Kafka's influence. Writers from Albert Camus to Jorge Luis Borges, from Gabriel Garcia Marquez to Haruki Murakami, drew from his surreal blending of the ordinary and the absurd. Borges, in particular, praised Kafka for creating parables that seemed ancient and timeless, stories that could be read as myths even though they were modern. Kafka's world, quiet offices, dingy apartments, endless corridors, became the setting for mythic struggles, as though Olympus had moved into the bureaucracy. This fusion of the mundane and the transcendent shaped much of modernist and postmodernist literature. Quirky episodes highlight this reach. In 1962, a major conference on Kafka was held in Israel, where scholars debated whether his work was primarily Jewish, universal, or both. The debates grew heated, with one faction insisting his imagery reflected the exile of the Jewish condition, while others argued that his parables applied to all humanity. The arguments themselves became almost Kafkaesque, scholars caught in an endless trial over meaning, citing his ambiguity as proof for opposite claims. It was as if Kafka had orchestrated the event from beyond the grave, ensuring his philosophy remained contested and unresolved. Through all this reception, one thing becomes clear. Kafka's philosophy cannot be reduced to a single school or doctrine. It is not systematic but fragmentary, not prescriptive but descriptive. He does not tell us what to believe. He shows us what it feels like to exist in a world where meaning recedes, where authority looms without explanation, where life persists in the face of uncertainty. His philosophy is experiential, a mood, a condition, and perhaps this explains its endurance. We return to Kafka not for answers but for recognition. We see in him a mirror of our own bewilderment, a reflection of our own trials. Kafka's philosophy also casts a long shadow over psychology. Living at the same time as Sigmund Freud, he shared the intellectual atmosphere of Vienna and Prague, where dreams, repression, and the unconscious dominated discussion. Though Kafka was not a Freudian disciple, his stories resonate with psychoanalytic themes. Guilt without cause, transformations that symbolize inner conflicts, authority figures who loom like projections of the father. Freud once described dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, and Kafka's fiction often reads like dreams set to prose, lucid in detail, yet irrational in structure. Consider the Metamorphosis again. Gregor Samsa awakens as a monstrous insect, a grotesque image that Freud might have read as a manifestation of suppressed anxieties about labor, family, and sexuality. The body betrays him, becoming both symbol and punishment. Kafka never explained the transformation, leaving interpretation open. Psychoanalysts seized on this openness, seeing in Gregor a case study of repression turned inside out. Was the insect form the embodiment of Gregor's self-loathing? Was it a subconscious protest against his role as provider? Or was it, as some argue, the eruption of the father's judgment into the son's body? Scholars still argue whether psychoanalysis illuminates Kafka or merely projects its own obsessions onto him. The letter to his father makes the psychoanalytic connection unavoidable. In it, Kafka describes feeling crushed under his father's authority, terrified by his size, his voice, his demands. He recalls a moment when, as a boy, he cried out for water at night. His father responded by carrying him out onto the balcony and leaving him there, alone in the dark. That I was then quite certainly obedient, Kafka writes, but internally I suffered. The scene reads like a primal trauma, a formative moment that echoes in Kafka's depictions of judgment and punishment. Freudian interpreters see in this letter the key to Kafka's entire philosophy. Authority internalized as guilt. Authority that never explains itself. Authority that becomes destiny. Yet others resist this reduction. To call Kafka merely neurotic is to ignore the universality of his vision. His characters resonate not only with those who suffered overbearing fathers, but with anyone who has felt small before systems of power. Psychology may illuminate the personal roots of his imagery, but it cannot exhaust their significance. Kafka's philosophy survives because it transcends biography, even as it emerges from it. This brings us back to the debates over where Kafka belongs philosophically. Existentialists embraced him as a precursor, dramatizing the absurd condition of humanity. Camus saw in him a writer who, like himself, confronted the silence of the universe without flinching. But others argue that Kafka is not existentialist at all. Since his characters rarely exercise freedom or assert autonomy, they are not Sartrean heroes creating their own essence, but figures trapped, diminished, suffocated. Some scholars suggest instead that Kafka belongs to the tradition of religious mysticism, portraying a world in which God exists but is forever hidden, his will unknowable. In this reading, the castle becomes an allegory of divine grace that never arrives, a pilgrimage without revelation. And then there is absurdism. Camus drew a distinction between Kafka and himself. For Camus, the absurd could be met with defiance, Sisyphus rolling his stone forever, yet choosing to embrace his fate. Kafka's characters, by contrast, rarely defy. They submit, they search, they wait. If Camus's philosophy ends with rebellion, Kafka's often ends with resignation. Does that make him bleaker? Or simply more honest? Scholars still debate whether Kafka was a rebel against the absurd, or its most faithful chronicler. Quirky interpretations abound. Some critics have argued that Kafka anticipated postmodernism, with its suspicion of systems and its embrace of ambiguity. Others find in him a prophet of the digital age, where faceless algorithms decide our fates as impersonally as any court in the trial. Still others see him as a writer of black comedy, his laughter echoing through the corridors of dread. The multiplicity of interpretations is itself part of his philosophy. He refuses to be claimed, refuses to be pinned down. His work lives in the gaps between systems, just as his characters live in the gaps between answers. Kafka's aphorisms underline this refusal of certainty. In one fragment he writes, "A cage went in search of a bird." The inversion is surreal, unsettling, and yet it captures the essence of his thought. Systems do not merely trap. They create the conditions in which life must fit. Meaning is not discovered but imposed, and often absurdly so. This aphorism could describe bureaucracy, religion, or even psychology itself, frameworks that shape the human condition without ever fully explaining it. In this way, Kafka's philosophy becomes a philosophy of limits. The limits of freedom, the limits of knowledge, the limits of interpretation. He does not offer liberation from these limits, but forces us to see them clearly. And in seeing them, we recognize our own reflection.